Hi, this is Tom House. Where this is the what episode is it here? It's the first, second, third, fourth, fifth episode of season two of Why Postliberalism Failed. Um, for those at home, um, there's a little bit of news. My co-host James Patterson, he just welcomed a baby girl named Genevieve, his wife, and his wife is having to lay in bed quite a bit because of things dealing with the pregnancy. Everything's going well though. The baby's healthy. But James won't be joining us today, so it's just going to be me, and it's going to be a little bit of a shorter episode. Um, I figured that it was time to go back to some of the basics here. We've been covering so many of these attempts at post-liberalism, you could say it, or attempts at of Catholic reactionary anti-liberalism uh, from the especially the early 20th century, when those things were all the rage in Catholic countries. But people ask like, well, what are these, what do these attempts have to do with today's post-liberalism? Well, the kind of post-liberalism that we're dealing with isn't everything that calls itself post-liberalism. We don't have any interest in responding to John Milbank or any of the Protestant post-liberals. Our main focus is this trend of the last, was it 15 years, the last 10 years especially, of Catholic post-liberalism. And I would say the biggest figure, although not the most radical, the biggest figure would be Patrick Deneen. Patrick Deneen calls himself a post-liberal, but he does not call himself an integralist or integralist, however you want to pronounce the term. Um, The integralists, Kevin Valier described the integralists as related to post-liberalism as being like 200 proof post-liberals, right? Integralists also um, go beyond some of the general characteristics of post-liberalism that we've seen, embracing a certain theological view of the Pope's indirect temporal authority justifying ecclesial penalties using the arm of the state, right? Um, and that would justify things like laws against heresy or against apostasy or all the sorts of things that are associated with that. Um, Patrick Deneen is not an integralist. James and I have some disagreements about the exact relationship of Patrick Deneen to integralism, but I'll give you my version of it. Um, but Patrick Deneen is very much politically connected with the contemporary integralists, not the more abstract integralists like Thomas Paine, who has no interest in reactionary politics. His concern with integralism is preserving what he sees as the church's teaching throughout the centuries. We respond to that in the book. We don't agree with him, but he has no interest in the reactionary politics. We mostly leave him alone besides responding to his interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae. But Patrick Deneen is very much involved in a political movement, in that political movement of post-liberalism. For him, his first major public statement of it, well, he had some articles before that, but the one that created the biggest splash was his book that came out in 2017 called Why Liberalism Failed. Why Liberalism Failed, it came from Yale University Press, and for a book published from an academic publisher, it was extraordinarily successful in sales. I think it was made over 100,000 copies sold. Um, Part of that success came from the fact that on his Facebook page, Barack Obama actually partially endorsed the book. He said it brings up a lot of good points. He recommended people read it. Um, and so hats off to Patrick Deneen. It's not easy to have such a successful book, especially through an academic publisher. So good on you. Um, the second major book that Patrick Deneen's come out with, since he really got involved heavily with this budding post-liberal movement that's connected that we've been discussing was called regime change, and that wasn't as successful as the first one. I'll talk about both. Um, One misunderstanding about Patrick Deneen's book that's common, I've seen it over and over again. A lot of people mentioned the book but didn't actually read the book, or they didn't read it very carefully. Because right away in the first few pages, Patrick Deneen connects this liberalism, which is what he's criticizing throughout the book, with the American experiment itself. He's not critiquing like the liberalism of Barack Obama per se, by its just the liberalism of like Barack Obama or John Rawls or the Democratic Party. He's going further back to what gets called classical liberalism. He sees it as a problematic notions that were right there at the beginning of the founding of the American Republic itself, right? So it is more radical than it sounds at first. It's not just a conservative critique of the Democratic Party. Um, he connects this idea of liberalism, runs it from Thomas Hobbes through John Locke, through Thomas Jefferson and the George Washington and the American founders, all the way through John Dewey and John Rawls, as James likes to say, pretty much anyone named John. Um, so it's a grander critique. The style of the book is kind of a diatribe. He's kind of going, it's a rant. It's a it's an extended rant. Um, and Sam Goldman describes its style also as a kind of Geistesgeschichte, which in German is like a um a spirit or ideological history, but it's a history of the spirit, history of the right. Um, and running through like the ways that ideas have transformed and affected the way we think throughout, you know. So some in the sort of that sort of vein. Okay. Um, it has similarities with Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. I had a little bit of a discussion of my own past of reading Alistair McIntyre, how he was very influential in my own thinking, although I came to critique certain elements of his politics, and some of the historical arguments he makes and After Virtue to defend those politics. Something very similar with why liberalism failed. So what's his critique? He what connects Thomas Hobbes to John Rawls or John Dewey for Patrick Deneen? Well, he connects it basically to the idea of social contract that you have in Thomas Hobbes, that it implies a consent that a view of morality that presupposes consent, right? Sort of voluntaristic ethic, right? He sees that as affecting the thought of John Locke, which I think is one of the areas where I criticize him. And then that affecting the founding fathers, and you know, leads from classical liberalism as a connecting idea to what we can think of now as progressivism. Um, that from Thomas Hobbes to Drag Queen Story Hour, there's this connection. One of the criticisms of the book that you even find in Adrian Vermeule's, another post-liberals review of it, is that it stays too abstract. That liberalism is floating around in the ideas as like sort of the monster that attacks history. Um, and Vermeule's uh, says that you need to connect it with how it affects agents in the real world, and that Deneen is less careful to do that. That he just sees this sort of spirit running through this idea, almost like an ideological virus that has a life of its own and changes the way that history goes. Um, as a theory of everything, as explaining everything that's gone wrong the last 300 years, those kind of stories, as I said with McIntyre, and the same thing goes with other similar stories. They tend to sell a lot of books. They tend to be very successful. Anything that can explain everything to you. Well, why read 300 books when I can just read this one, right? That's just the way it goes. Obviously, I've not I held back how critical I am of this type of historical argument. Obviously, I do think ideas have consequences, but when you start trying to explain everything that happens over 500 years based off one or two ideas that some philosopher had, I get a little skeptical. There's a lot going on. The world is complex. People try to do this with William of Ockham or Duns Scotus, and I'm just as skeptical of that. Right? Um, and I developed that skepticism, spending a long time studying the history of philosophy, but also having some interest in history itself, not just the ideas that people had, but the way things worked out on the ground, right? And I think you have to try to keep those two things in the air, um, and to have the right attitude about these sorts of things. Okay, so Deneen's argument. Deneen. Let me pull up something really quick. Uh, so Deneen went to undergrad at Rutgers University, and he had a professor there named William Carey McWilliams. William Carey McWilliams had a book called The Idea of Fraternity in America in 1973 book. Matt Frank, oh, he was retired. He used to teach at Princeton and work at the James Madison program at Princeton University. Has a good article from last year. It's The Bookshelf, The Brotherhood of Man, The Fatherhood of Teachers, February 22nd, 2024, in which he explains to the reader this book, Wilson Carey McWilliams, and shows how it was the sort of genesis of Deneen's ideas. So it's worth, if you want to learn where Deneen gets some of this stuff, you can go back to um, this book, The Idea of Fraternity in America by Wilson Carey McWilliams. Um, There's several elements that he gets out of this sort of liberalism monster. It starts with the social contract. Um, yeah, he tries to connect this with Locke by pointing to Locke's view on divorce, that after the children are raised, divorce is licit. Um, that he says that implies a sort of consent-based understanding of ethics. I don't know. Locke is very clear that he believes in the natural law, natural duties, that all of that. So, I mean, to say because he treats divorce as listed after children are raised, it's kind of a stretch, in my opinion. But that's his argument. I mean, are the obviously the Pharisees and the Bible who supported the laicity of divorce were not influenced by Hobbes's account of consent-based ethics. And neither were apparently the apostles who considered it a tough teaching. It's just considered a tough teaching all around. Um, that's, I don't know, probably the more obvious explanation for that position. But for Deneen, he sees it as explanation for why Locke, whatever. So you get the idea, right? Um, But so this thing that runs through history, this liberalism that runs through the history of ideas, he'll say that you're connected also with R R Roger Bacon, and the way that, if anyone's read Roger Bacon and his New Organon, uh, there's an emphasis on mastering nature that to an environmentalist makes them feel somewhat uncomfortable. Deneen connects that sort of attempt to master nature, to rule over nature, also with this liberalism monster that connect runs through, blaming it for the degradation of the environment. Um, he also believes that liberalism, as monster runs through history, is responsible for creating a kind of anti-culture. that culture gets washed down because of the obsession with sort of a pluralism. Nobody is really right or whatever. So we're not allowed to have a thicker culture with thicker viewpoints. You're right. Um, and my own response to this in my book manuscript that I've been working on the last 5 years um, is similar to my critique of McIntyre. It seemed he connects it with what he calls liberal laws. I'm guessing what he has in mind are um, like the federal government instituting uh, limitations on the kind of laws that can be made at lower levels of government, protecting scopes of liberty, so that don't allow for a thicker understanding of the good life, that they sort of teach a lesson about the thicker. So maybe something about like public morality laws or something. Um, if that's possible, he doesn't say, so you have to kind of guess. Um, Now, of course, people who accept the American experiment and classical liberalism have disagreements about public morality laws. I mean, I have disagreements. I mean, it seems to me, and I mean, nowadays, if you don't want a strip club in your town, you have to argue that it affects the resale. If it's an actual strip club, you have to say that, or even ones where there's not nudity, but there's everything else. If you need something, want to not allow something like that in your town, normally you have to make some argument about it affecting resale values, which to me is a little absurd. I think if towns should be able to just not allow that stuff if they don't want to, right? Because you have your kids in town and they could affect them. It's not it. There are negative externalities. That's just my opinion. That doesn't matter. These are just agreements that classical liberals have. Um, but Deneen thinks that sort of this consent-based ethics, which we do find in modern culture, is the responsibility of these ideas that go back to the Hobbesian that show up in um, the American experiment. My criticism of him is similar to that of Deneen, that I think he's getting at something, a sort of anti-culture, but I don't think it's an issue of law so much as education. Um, when you have a large centralized education system, you have to deal with a lot of pluralism within that, and you don't want to offend anybody. So the kind of ethic that you can produce gets very, very thin in that kind of educational environment. That's one of the reasons I prefer a pluralistic model that allows for instance, with school choice or vouchers or educational savings accounts, which allows for um, people to take their money to the school they want to, which might be a sectarian school where they can get a thick account of the good life there, right? That, so that I'm willing to grant to him in the my manuscript that he's gone to something, but it's more at the level of education than at the government. Um, yeah, similar. He's sort of anti-capitalist in there. He's anti-big government, at least. He supports local government. He thinks that people should ignore, sort of get away from larger politics and focus on getting involved with local democracy. So there's a little bit of a Tocquevillian argument a little bit of Tocquevillian element of why liberalism failed. Um, and uh, and as far as the institutions, you might ask, what's wrong with the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution? Um, in why liberalism failed, he said maybe you could have something like the U.S. Constitution and you know, its system of constitutional governance without the liberalism behind it. He doesn't know. He says you maybe. He leaves it open as a possibility. Now, fast forward to regime change, and he positively rejects it. He says that sort of separations and checks and balances, that especially context with the separations implicit in the design of the Constitution, is already liberal, and he rejects it. So there's a movement away from just whatever. But then in some settings, like he was talking at a NetCon event in 2021, and he tried to say that uh, even though he's had all those criticisms in his books and everything about the U.S. Constitution being a mistake and other, he said, well, that maybe the founding fathers actually agreed with me. It depends on who his audience is. But the main line of what he said in his major works that have been popular, um, is sort of opposed to the American experiment, that it was kind of a mistake. And maybe it's just a matter of what mood he's in, I'm not sure. But that's the part that his critics are most focused on. Um, so what happened is after Deneen writes his book, Adrian Vermeule has that review I mentioned about integration from within. And in that he says that you know, you can't just like sit around doing local democracy and hope that something better emerges. That liberalism is going to collapse under its own weight, and then something else better is going to emerge. Is what how the way that Patrick Deneen ends the book. Um, but Vermeule doesn't like that. He says, no, 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 we got to be prepare for the collapse, so we can maybe capture the bureaucracy, try to capture the bureaucracy and nudge people in a post-liberal direction. One of the proposals that Adrian Vermeule had around that time when he was open with everyone about his thoughts, when he would write up for the Josias and he was less worried about what he said in public was you could nudge immigration law to welcome only Catholics into the country to set up for a Empire of Guadalupe down the road, right? Obviously, that Vermeule and Deneen both connected with these post-liberals in Orban's Hungary, both connected with people in the Trump administration, do not want to be pushing that anymore, right? Now the emphasis is on reducing immigration, right? Which now Vermeule says also requires a strong bureaucracy. That's a common thread in Vermeule is a very strong executive and bureaucracy. Um, so yeah, that he supported before he was even a post-liberal. So that's very specific to Vermeule's brand of post-liberalism. But it has he has his followers. Um, so those two kind of become friends. Add to them Sohrab Ahmari, Chad Pecknold, who's a theologian who specializes in Augustine. People like Nathan Pinkowski, all these people. Rod Dreher, who's kind of a non-integralist, post-liberal. Um, all these people connected with Orban in Hungary. They're connected with J.D. Vance. So these are the post-liberals that we're focused on. But Deneen has always kind of seemed like the more moderate of these ones. And I mean, he even ends he doesn't like America, but he ends why post-liberalism failed with an emphasis on local democracy. It doesn't sound very radical, even if he's a little bit radical in his interpretation. It's cynical in his interpretation of America, which I think is mistaken. I mean, why I think it's mistaken? I mean, basically. Um, Social contract was in the air. There was all sorts of varieties of it. You had the social contract theory of Thomas Hooker. You had the social contract theory of the Spanish scholastics. You had social contract theory of Thomas Hobbes, and you had the covenant theory of the Calvinists. You had John Locke, who was kind of a mix of a bunch of things. And there's a good 80-90% of it is similar to Thomas Hooker. Maybe imports a little bit too much of Hobbes when he, gets to notions like tacit consent implies that he's the consent part of this is playing a bigger role than it would have in the classical social contract thinkers like the scholastics. Um, yeah, but still, I mean, what is the influence of John Locke? I mean, first of all, John Locke, the interpretation is a very one-sided interpretation of John Locke. But whatever John Locke is, what's his influence on the American founders? Well, the big thing is the right of revolution, which is affirmed even in medieval scholasticism. All right. So it's not, whatever. And the primacy of Parliament. So a certain Whig understanding of British constitutionalism of a parliament that holds the king in check, right? that, and then his defense of private property. Defense of private property. I'm sorry. I've spent 18 years studying Thomas Aquinas, and I've heard some of these stories, interpretations of John Locke on property, from Thomas. And I've been studying natural law the whole time. I just do not buy their interpretation of John Locke. I mean, my interpretation of John Locke is basically that later popes who basically borrowed from John Locke, like Leo the 13th and Pius the 11th, he was basically the same. Um, it's I do not buy that, and especially if you read the first treatise and the second treatise or whatever. And I mean, he has right. I mean, Locke believes in there's other things, evidence that he supported eminent domain, just like Suarez. That does not see private property as absolute at all. He is not a Nozikian. He doesn't even see his ownership of self as absolute, that you have duties to God with regard to it. That uh he yeah, you have duties of charity and all this sort of thing. It's like it it would not have been, in my opinion, it would not have been controversial to the civil and canon lawyers of the Middle Ages who wrote a lot on private property. I mean, the mainstream view was to ground private property um, uh, in occupation. When you occupy a land and then that's not occupied, you claim it. But actually was a labor theory of property rights in some of the writers, or at least one. I found it in one writer of the 12th century, of those canon lawyers. Um, yeah, no, I mean, they would not have seen it as controversial. It would have been one view among many. It would not have been seen as controversial. So I actually don't buy any of that. I explain it a little bit more in my manuscript, but uh, so uh, so Locke. But then, what's the relationship of Locke then to the founders? He has a bigger influence on the founders in 1776 than in 1789, and that's because of the defense of the right of revolution. And they're having a revolution that appeal to heaven is what John Locke called it. Um, but John Locke is he's one of many influences for the Constitution, insofar as he's contributing to the intellectual tradition of modern constitutionalism. Um, uh, in his emphasis on Parliament as a check on the king, which is basically the Whig theory of the British Constitution, which had some influence then on Montesquieu. And then you have the other further reflections on the British Constitution of John Blackstone. John Blackstone's working a long tradition of common lawyers who were reflecting on the British Constitution and its merits, going back to the Middle Ages. And one of the things you see in that tradition is an emphasis on checks on power. So the checks and balances mentioned by John Blackstone, that's part of the vocabulary of modern constitutionalism. The other influences are the Spanish, I'm sorry, the Scottish Enlightenment, people like Hume and Smith and Ferguson, and then just the brilliant thinkers of the founding era. They had all these experiments with the state constitutions before they had the Constitution, that were sources of reflection, and they were reflecting on historical constitutions. You see in the front of those papers, they're trying to figure out solve the problem of small republics. That small republics, so like the small republics you find in northern Italy during the early Middle Ages and the Middle Ages. Actually, just in the Middle Ages, they were constantly under threat of larger powers, of like the Papal States or of the Holy Roman Empire. Um, and what was it about then the League of Republics in Switzerland that was superior to that? And so that's all the sorts of reflections that they're going through, reflecting on the Glorious Revolution and what they've learned from that, and what the sort of anti-monarchical um, elements that have come in. They just had a revolution against the king. They didn't want another king. All these things are going on. There's a lot going on. John Locke is just one little tiny voice among many, and not that big of a voice by the time you get to the Constitution. It's a bigger voice when you're applying the rhetoric of revolution before that. Um, when you go back to the Revolution too, when you get to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was a big fan of John Locke, but he also just said that these ideas were everywhere. I mean, it wasn't just John Locke; it was this common view that should be government by consent of the people, by the people, for the people, and that the sovereign there were limits on the sovereignty of a government. That that there were certain rights that you had that were inalienable. That I mean, you can find that from Jesuits in England in the 1600s. Talking, I also cover that in my manuscript or whatever. These are just by this point, this was the air everyone was breathing. You can find some of the earliest people you find talking this way are like, I'm not saying that this it's not direct, but indirect. Some of the earliest people you find talking this way are people like Robert Bellarmine and the Spanish scholastics, who, following Cajetan, this is a little known fact about history. Cajetan, in his debates with the conciliarists in the early 1500s, the conciliarists thought that like the authority of the Pope came from the consent of the church, right? And that's called conciliarism, and it was considered eventually ruled a heresy in the church. Um, but in his debates with the conciliarists, Cajetan acknowledged, he said, yeah, that's okay. You guys apply that to the church and to civil society. That works with the civil society, but not with the church, was a divine institution. So Cajetan's actually kind of validates the civil side of conciliarism, even though he's a papalist, and the other papalists of the Spanish scholastics go along with that, right? So there's a long history of these ideas, and they did not start with Thomas Hobbes, right? Um, so that's one of the issues. It just tries to explain too much. Um, One of the other things is Denine's a fierce critic of capitalism and its emphasis on competition, and he's a little bit more of a sort of is similar to the communitarian critiques of capitalism that are very common in right-wing Catholic circles. Uh, so Deneen in his book will downplay any sort of the claims that, oh, this has made us richer. He's like, well, we can buy a bunch of more consumer goods. He'll say, dismiss it, right? But I mean, the wealth that we've accumulated from modern constitutional democracy is a lot more than that. It's child mortality rates going from 50% to less than 5%, right? It's literacy rates going from 20% to almost 100%, right? He talks about the liberalism's attack on classical education. He doesn't mention how few people historically had access to classical education or any education at all, or even literacy, because people were so poor, right? People were just so poor, right? So, I mean, but he does recognize some of the fruits of liberalism, the good fruits. He says he supports religious freedom, right? And in my book manuscript, or in my response to him, I don't remember where I've written this, but I've said this many times to people. I said he does support religious freedom. He's not an integralist. But he also supports institutional arrangements that are very sort of uh, that de-emphasize separation, checks and balances, or pluralism. The respect for de facto pluralism. He sees any attempt to respect de facto pluralism as promoting like to make things more pluralistic. That's one of the criticisms of his book and his interpretation of Federalist 10 is he sees James Madison as saying it's a good thing that we push more pluralism, which isn't what James Madison was just trying to say we need to protect liberty, right? Um, but those emphases, he might say he wants religious liberty, but the institutions he promotes historically have not been very good to religious liberty. So I guess that's a disagreement I have with him, not at the level of ethical principle, but at the level of political institutions. Um, so yeah, that's Deneen. In regime change, he said he gets a little bit more radical. As I said, he rejects the separation of powers implicit in American constitutionalism. He wants to, he say, use Machiavellian means towards Aristotelian ends. He wants to use populism as a way to create a better elite that has a better relationship with the people, right? So the idea is creating a new elite. You can see how that connects with Patrick Deneen and people like Christopher Rufo, is they saw that as their role within the Trump administration is to create a new elite. Um, and that's why he's going after the colleges, trying to create openings for their kind of people. So, it's that uh, this is more of a Vermeule thing, but the reward your friends, punish your enemies. Will reward your friends by putting them into these positions of prestige within the bureaucracy and with academia. So that's the Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends thing that Denine's promoting, and which was endorsed by J.D. Vance and Christopher Rufo and these people. Um, so what was interesting, in his first season we did mention this, that Deneen, while he is seen as the more moderate of these post-liberals, um, raised some eyebrows to us in his interview with Bishop Barron last year when he said that he's teaching a class on opponents of liberalism. And the people that he was saying were right in their critiques, proven right in their critiques of liberalism, are Bonald, Bilot, the French Jesuit, and Donoso Cortés, who was the famous Spanish theorist of dictatorship, who influenced Carl Schmitt. So that connects that was a really important piece of the puzzle for us because he is the one guy we didn't see connecting himself with the sort of anti-liberal reactionary tradition. And then here, but he's still connected with these guys connected with Hungary and Orban. And there he's promoting it on Bishop Barron's uh, show. And he's saying that while the church affirmed liberal democracy in the Second Vatican Council, now reading the signs of the times, it's time for them to rethink that and look for different arrangements, post-liberal arrangements. So there has been, depending on the audience he's talking to, it seems to be a clear trajectory of radicalization on the part of Patrick Deneen. One time he did even said that he supported an ecumenical integralism, but he deleted that tweet. I don't know if he still believes that or if it um, wasn't a clear articulation of what he supports. Um, but yeah, I mean, I don't think Deneen wants uh he is still is one of the more moderate ones of them. I don't think he wants to punish heretics or anything like that, but he is supportive of a more reactionary anti-liberal democracy position. And that's how he connects with what we've been talking about in these episodes. So well, that's gonna be it. I think you guys can only handle so much of just me talking to you. So, and it's nice I'm gonna miss having James on here. Hopefully, James will be back for the next episode. Um, and just remember to subscribe and to like and to hit the notification button. And we'll be back next week for another episode. Please tell your friends about us, and please look forward to our book and some of the other articles that we're going to be writing. We'll look out for some other articles we'll be writing about post-liberalism. Have a good one.